media, YouTube, Facebook. We have a great program lined up tonight with Greatest Generation Live. We're going to get the music playing and let everybody in, get things started. We're here with Greg Yost and Glenn Flickinger, and we'll be joined by Colin Heaton to have our talk tonight. Thanks for being here. Here we go. Evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Greatest Generation Live for Thursday, August 21st. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit in Western PA, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We do it all year long, mostly Monday nights and Thursday nights. And yes, we even do it during Steeler nights. So I'm glad to see our audience here tonight because it's preseason and it doesn't matter. So come here and enjoy a good educational, historical conversation with the VBC and our host, Glenn Flickinger. Glenn, how are you?
I'm excellent. I'm excellent. Yeah, the Steelers actually asked us come down and do this program at halftime, but we didn't think it was a big enough audience. We'd rather stick with our loyal Zoom guys, right? And girls. So anyway, thank you so much for being with us tonight and not watching the Steeler game. We'll be more careful when the regular season rolls around, though. It's a little more competitive in the regular season when we go up against the Steelers. So, Greatest Generation Live, for maybe the few of you who are not familiar, everything World War II, interviewing World War II vets, discussing World War II topics. Tonight's discussion is VJ Day, Victory in Japan. And we have three excellent historians with us and one sort of okay one. I'm the okay one. We've got Greg Yost. Greg, say hello, please.
Hello, nice to be here. Thanks for having this. Looking forward to this.
Who is a frequent contributor and loyal member. We thank you. Has Colin made it in yet? Sean, have you seen Colin?
I have not seen Colin as of yet. I'm sure he'll be here, but I haven't seen him yet.
Yeah, so Colin Heaton, who our members know quite well, is also joining us tonight. And then I'm hopeful that Michel Perdi, and there he is. I see Michel now. There he is. Let's unmute Michel. Todd.
Hey, how's it going?
Very good. Very good. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I love the backdrop there. Looks like it's the Big Apple.
This is the Big Apple. This is. Few worms, but it's still pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. And I thought you were on vacation, Michel.
I am. I got the dates wrong, so we're actually leaving tomorrow for the Berkshire. So I'm just still in my office here, doing my real grown-up job, and which is not nearly as interesting as World War II history. I can promise that.
I agree. So for those of you who, just to remind you, we had Michel on 4 or 5 weeks ago about his book on Dwight Eisenhower and the light of battle. Was just a fascinating program with Michel. He's not only a great writer, excellent speaker, and it was a great night with Michel. We've kept up a dialogue, Michel and I, over the last month or so, and I asked him a few questions about the decision to drop the bomb and being a World War II nerd, which I think I can use that term, Michel, right?
That's fair. That's tough but fair. Yeah.
I get accused of that all the time by my family. So we back and forth on this topic, and turns out Michel has a lot of knowledge and some opinions about that question. And so he's been kind enough to join us tonight to contribute to the discussion. Okay. So what we're going to do tonight is Greg, Colin, and I divided up VJ Day into 3 pieces. I mean, it's such a long, complex story that we could be here 3 days, not just a day and a half. But three pieces of the story. Greg is going to cover Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan that never happened. And it's important to understand, I believe, the planning for Operation Downfall, which had been going on for quite some time, at least the year before the bomb was dropped, more intensely, obviously, as time came closer, and what the plans were if we didn't get the bomb or the bomb didn't work or whatever, and how that also contributed to the decision to drop the bomb. Colin, if he joins us, is going to cover the Russian aspect because that plays a part in the Japanese decision to surrender as well. And then I'm going to cover the actual decision to drop the bomb. How was it made? Who was involved in making it? Not so much why. I think that'll come out in all three discussions. Okay. Why really anymore, I think is pretty obvious. And then if we have time, I would say we cover just a little bit of the actual Japanese decision to surrender and what happened within the Japanese government, such as it was at that time, to make the decision to actually surrender. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover tonight. Let's see. Anything else that I want to get into before that? I don't think so. So, Greg, we're going to start with you. Okay.
Sounds good. Yes, Glenn, if you can fire up my PowerPoints, that'd be great. So I will be talking about something that didn't happen. So that it's in and of itself, I think, is sort of an interesting angle here. It's the planned invasion of Japan at the end of the war. It was known as Operation Downfall. And here's my sort of first slide here that talks about the final and never realized U.S. and Allied plan to invade Japan and end World War II. It's supposed to start on 1 November 1945, and it was going to culminate in the invasion of the main island in March of 46. That's pretty basic there, and hopefully everything here is going to make sense around that, all the stuff that I'm going to get into. So if you want to go into the next slide here, of course, other things intervened, the atomic bombings and the Soviet invasion, which happened roughly at the same time. And Glenn and Colin will be calling those. But here are the basics. And I don't know how well this is going to show up there, but hopefully on these maps of Japan, you see the highlighted portions there. The very southern end of Japan was going to be the first part invaded. That was called Operation Olympic. That was scheduled to start on the 1st of November in 45. It was going to be the largest invasion of the war, larger than Operation Overlord, largest than the Philippines, the Okinawa invasion. And that was the first part of it. After they got a beachhead there, the second part was going to be called Operation Coronet, where they're going to invade the main island there, sort of roughly at the elbow there of the J, which is roughly where Tokyo is located. And the plan there was to knock the Japanese out of the war. So when the war ended, that we know in August of 45, the military planners were already looking at 8, 9, 10 extra months of fighting. You can go to the next slide if you want. Here's an outline, and there's far too much to cover, as there always is. But I want to do sort of a deep history because I think the Japanese defensive plan for this goes way back to sort of their main goals of the war that happened much earlier, even long before the war. We'll do a little bit of brief history of the Pacific Operation in parts 2 and 3, the PTO, the Pacific Theater of Operations. And then we'll get into the actual operation itself and all that was involved. I would highlight section number 5 there, where amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. If you go back to those maps, any one of us could say, oh, we're going to invade here and then we're going to come up there. Easy to say, not easy to do. So then we'll get to the Japanese plans and sort of some of the what ifs. So if you want to go to the next slide. We tend to think of the war as starting on December 7th, 1941, but the Japanese empire from the mid-1800s had been expanding dramatically. They had shut themselves off from the world, but they made a very quick catch-up industrially, economically, educationally, militarily. And by the late 1800s, they were starting to take over much of Eastern Asia. Now, China was falling apart at the time, so they sort of took over some old Chinese islands like Okinawa. and Formosa during a war. The Russians were coming out to the east there, and they attacked the Russians and beat them and got some Russian concessions there, and got Korea. So this is all before World War One. They jumped on the bandwagon of World War One, where Germany, the last of the major European colonial empires, had been gobbling up some Pacific islands in the Central Pacific. Japan entered the war, World War One, for a good 6 weeks, and got all those German Pacific islands. So they were a major player by the 1920s, so much so that in an arms negotiation called the Washington Naval Treaty, the US, British, and Japan were now considered the top 3 naval powers in the world. France and Italy were distant 4th and 5th places. Japan was really on the move. By the 30s, they had taken over Manchuria, which, as China was falling apart, Manchuria was sort of separated. They set up a puppet government called Manchukuo. And in 37, they invaded all of China, regular China, which you could make a strong argument is the real beginning of World War II. The late 30s, and as the European powers fell apart, they took over French Indochina, which we now all know as Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. The Dutch East Indies. Friendly thing to remember is, a lot like Britain, Japan is an island nation. It is very poor in resources. So all of this land grabbing was an economic necessity if they wanted to get the resources. They were really on the move long before the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was sort of designed to keep the U.S. out, which is where we start here. PTO stands for Pacific Theater of Operations. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They set the U.S. back, but not as far back as they had hoped. They as soon as they attacked the U.S. and got the U.S. out of the way, so to speak, they went back to East Asia. They attacked the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore. That was their real intent: get the U.S. out of the way and go west. For them, it would be west. For us, we call it the Far East. So this sort of worked for a while, but they didn't get enough of the U.S. fleet. The U.S. started to sort of make some annoying raids, including the Doolittle raid over Tokyo in April 42, which didn't do a lot of damage, but did a lot of psychological damage. So the Japanese come back and they say, we're going to get those U.S. fleet. Should have been done long ago. Should have done it the first time around. So they send a couple of fleets out, Coral Sea, and then Midway, which is a real turning point in the war, where they lose 4 of their major carriers in like 5 minutes. It's an amazing defeat for the Japanese Navy. And after this, the U.S. starts to take the initiative, Guadalcanal. And so the U.S. starts to island hop across the Pacific. They don't want to take every fortified Japanese island that the Japanese have fortified. They just blow past them. The 2 largest, it's going to be a little hard to see on some of these maps, the 2 largest Japanese bases in the Pacific, Rabaul and Truk Lagoon, were ignored. The U.S. just bypassed them. They bombed them. They cut them off of supplies, but the U.S. island hopped across. I don't know how well this map shows it. Maybe the map on the circle there. I don't know if you can see there's 2 main thrusts across the Pacific Ocean. There's sort of the Central Pacific, which is led by the U.S. Navy, Nimitz. Remember that name, and southern part across New Guinea and into the Philippines. That's led by Douglas MacArthur. So this is all going on in 43 and 44, but the Japanese are ignoring this. They don't think it's a big threat. They just sort of ignore it. As late as March of 1944, they invade India. Doesn't go well, but they invade India. April 44, they launch a major offensive in China. They're pretending like none of this is happening until the invasion of the Central Pacific, the Marianas, which I think is the next slide. This is in June of 40. Oh, okay. By the way, there were enormous casualties there. You look at some of these battles in the Pacific, and the bold-faced numbers are the killed in actions. The parentheses numbers are the unit size. So, for example, on Guadalcanal, the U.S. had about 60,000 troops, 7,100 killed. Eniwetok told 5,390 killed. Look at the Japanese numbers. Look at the killed ratio versus the number of troops that they had. This is a really interesting phenomenon, that the Japanese didn't surrender. They committed harikiri, or they launched banzai suicide attacks when they were about to lose. Look at the killed in action versus the number of troops there on the Japanese side. As we get closer to the invasion, those numbers really start to freak out the United States. We want to go to the next one. So rather frighteningly, those numbers that we're seeing in the Pacific are nothing. You can compare them to the European theater, where the real action was in the East with the Germans and the Soviets. The Holocaust, if you want to put that in there, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has a rough estimate of 17 million people murdered from all the camps and medical experiments and everything else. Japanese were basically doing the same thing in China. Massive civilian casualties. Furthermore, if you look over there on the left, Japan had most of its army still in China. So you get into the summer of 44, the U.S. starts to get closer to Japan. They invade the Marianas in the Central Pacific, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, which Japan had considered to be part of their inner circle. That invasion was in June of 44. That was almost as large as Operation Overlord. So the U.S. is conducting on 2 parts of the world, 2 major, these like monster military operations. The fall of 44, the U.S. returns to the Philippines. Both of those created huge naval defeats for the Japanese when the Japanese came out to fight. So things are not looking good for Japan. Culminates here in the Battle of Okinawa, which starts on April 1st, April Fool's Day, also Easter Sunday. And if you can see where Okinawa is at the bottom of that map, it's sort of part of the Japanese islands itself. We're no longer talking about old German possessions way out in the middle of nowhere. This is sort of part of the Japanese islands. It also had a large civilian population on it. 7 U.S. divisions, 500,000 U.S. personnel, 31 U.S. carriers. The Royal Navy started to participate. The Japanese had 3 major divisions, 70,000 troops, but they started to recruit civilians as like cannon fodder and suicidal missions. And if you can tell from some of those pictures there, it is the beginning of the kamikaze, where the Japanese come out, and we all know what the kamikazes were, and that really scares the United States. So a couple things happened during the Battle of Okinawa. And I'm going to stop here, but I have to go to the next slide here. So a couple of details on Okinawa. It's within bombing distance, like in the European sense, of Japan, at least the southern part. Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies on April 12th during the Battle of Okinawa, before the end of the war in Europe. Ernie Pyle is killed, and he was, of course, the spokesperson for the ground grunt. So we have the top of the top, and the guy speaking for the bottom are both casualties of Okinawa in a way. European war ends. There's some soldiers there at the bottom listening to VE Day surrender in Okinawa. And there's some modern weapons that start to get used there. We get into radar controlled bombs and all sorts of fun stuff. So this is getting ready for the actual invasion. Are you guys tired yet? So was the US. Look at the casualty figures there. But about half of the casualties were in the last 8 months, from August 44 up to April 45, June, July. So the first 32 months of the war and the last 11 months had roughly equivalent casualties. And this is going to factor in. We tired out yet? We getting ready for the invasion? Ready to drop the bombs? Any questions?
Yeah, let's pause there. And a nice quick summary of the Pacific War leading up to Okinawa and the possible invasion of Japan. I would just volunteer. I like this slide. Are we tired yet? You know, if you go back and read the newspapers in 1945, it was very clear the American public was ready to finish the war. They were tired of the casualties. You know, 400,000 killed. That's 400,000 Gold Star mothers or families. And the other part of this was the draft had picked up dramatically starting in January of 45, almost doubled the number of draftees in January, February, and March of 45 in anticipation of what? The invasion of Japan and the expected casualties.
And also, by drafting people, that means they weren't enlisting, because remember, it was your patriotic duty to enlist. And now people aren't enlisting at the same rate that they had been enlisting.
So any I don't know, Michelle, any comments you'd like to make, or anybody in the audience like to ask a question?
Sure. Yeah. No, I thought that was a great summary of the war, and I think it's also, easy to forget how brutal the war in Japan had become by that point. We had begun the firebombing campaign in March, really in earnest. And we're, in the firebombing of Tokyo, we killed 100,000 Japanese in a day, mostly civilians. And so it wasn't just that the war was grinding on and exhausting, from the American perspective, certainly from the Japanese perspective as well. I think everyone had gotten to the point of wondering, what's it going to take to finally bring this thing to a close.
There's even some evidence. We should mention, Sean, if you have that picture of our last magazine, you could throw up for a second. There's just a great article in there written by who's that guy? Todd something? Todd DePastino. That's him. Todd DePastino. He's such an excellent writer, but it's this great article about VJ Day and the discussion within the Japanese government between the two factions, the peace faction and the war faction. And of course, Hirohito is not part of either one. He sits on the crown and frowns once in a while. It's a incredibly dysfunctional government. It's as dysfunctional a government as, I don't know, has ever existed. Maybe there was something back in the medieval days that was as dysfunctional, but none that had the kind of firepower that Japan had. It's just a great article, and I recommend you read it. We'll touch on a couple pieces of that a little bit later. So if unless there's any other questions from the audience, we want to give everybody a chance to participate. We'll put up the PowerPoint and allow Craig to go on. Greg, sorry.
Okodoko. So you ready for the grand finale? All right. So maybe this is going to happen. So the U.S. planning for this begins in early 40. Begins way back, but by early 45, they start to take very seriously the notion that on 1 November 1945, which was called X Day, not D-Day, but X Day, they were going to take over the southern part of Japan. So Olympic was the name for that first part of the operation. 14 U.S. divisions. I don't know what that means to you guys. Like, what was Overlord? What, 5 or 6 on day one? Day one, and well, of course, the airborne, so 7 or 8 maybe.
Yeah, 7 divisions.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah, 7 divisions on day one.
7 divisions. So this is twice the size of Normandy, right? Way on the other side of the world. 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, 400 destroyers. Tactical air forces were going to take off from Okinawa, 2 strategic bombs from the Marianas and 1 from Okinawa. They're going to be bombing Japan silly. If you look at the beach names, if you recognize those names, the beaches were named after U.S. automobiles at the time, for what it's worth, whatever. It's an interesting little trivia thing, code names for the beaches, such as they were. So this is the planned invasion of southern Japan in November of 45. Go to the next slide.
Specifically, the island of Kyushu.
Kyushu, yes. I'm sorry, that's right. The southernmost island. They didn't even want to take it all. They just wanted to turn it into a sort of forward operating base. Every indication is that the British, Canadians, Australians, New Zealand were going to come into the fight and operate in tandem. They weren't going to be separate sort of corps or anything. They were all going to sort of work together. So the grand finale here in the Pacific, where the Soviets going to get involved. That's Colin's job when we get to that. So you can go to the next slide there. So where'd all these troops come from? Early in the war, in December 41, the U.S. and British decided that Germany was target number 1. So everything that happened in the Pacific is like 1/5 of the effort that's going into Europe. So 4/5 is going into Europe. Where do these troops come from? They come from Europe, or a lot of them are going to come from Europe, right? In the European theater operations, you said 2.4 million troops, 63 divisions, 16 armored, 3 paratroopers, or 2 army groups. But these guys had gone through a lot. So there's a serious question as to whether or not some of them should be discharged. It comes down to the point system, the ASRS. We'll get into that in Q&A. Another factor here is that Europe was completely destroyed. Germany, Austria, just bombed silly. There's a film of Patton describing this. Even listening to Patton talk about the destruction sort of chills your spine about how badly it was destroyed. There could have been civil unrest, which there wasn't. Could have been disease and famine, which there wasn't. There were millions of displaced people. So you're going to need a large presence there. And the Soviets, were they going to start acting up? So the US and the British still needed to keep a lot of forces there. How do you get these people to the Pacific? Shortest route is the Suez Canal, but the logistics of going through the Indian Ocean aren't all that good. Maybe they could stop off in British-controlled India, but is this a wise political decision to get the US involved in the decades-long struggle between the British and the Indians? Interesting politics there. The most effective way to get these troops is to go back across the Atlantic, through the United States, and back to the Pacific. Does anyone see a problem with that?
A long way.
Well, it's a long way, but does anyone know what a 48-hour pass baby is? Guys who hadn't seen their wives and had never met their children, and their moms and their brothers who didn't come back, and imagine shipping them off, dropping them off in New York Harbor, and they take a train to Peoria, and then they have to get on another train and go to San Fran and go out to the Pacific. Incredibly difficult political decision. That picture there shows VE Day, when a lot of people think the war was over.
If I could tell a quick story about one of our own veterans, and I heard this personally from him when we were visiting New Orleans earlier this year with the our World War II group for the museum. And that's Warren Goss. Who at 101 is still with us.
Yep.
Warren Goss, who has been on our program many, many times. Mostly he attends the in-person events. Warren Goss was at Utah Beach before the first wave. Warren Goss was a rifleman for the engineer battalion that was landed to clear the obstacles. And he was like one of the first, couple dozen guys to touch Utah Beach that morning. Warren Goss fights through all of Normandy, fights through all of France, gets to Germany, is somewhat concussed at one point in time and pulled off the line, but fights all the way to the end of the war. Was not awarded the Purple Heart.
Yeah.
Did not earn any medals. Warren is a ornery sort of guy, even at 101, and he was a hell of a lot more ornery at 18 or 19. So he actually did not have enough points. Despite all that service, he did not have enough points to go home. However, he is sent home, and he comes back to Pittsburgh for a couple of weeks in the summer of 45. He spends it with his family. And Warren said, I walked down the street after my 2 weeks was off to catch the bus, to catch the train, to go back to wherever it was with his unit, and he cried. And he said it was the first time he had cried in the whole war. And he said, you know why? He goes, because I was going to go to the invasion of Japan, and I figured there was absolutely no way I was going to make it through that after having made it through all of Europe, the European battles.
Multiply that story 2.4 million times.
Yeah. So, despite, I don't know, if it had been me, I'd have hidden in the basement until they pulled me out. But there's a man who fought all the way through Europe and, found it within himself to, go to the train station, to get back to his unit, to participate in the invasion of Japan, which of course then doesn't happen.
I'll try to blitz through the rest. I think we're getting the gist of this, but go ahead if you want to go back to the slides there. So they're going to send all these troops to the Pacific here. So amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. You can go to the next one there. So there's another interesting question here. Who are they going up against? That's a really long story there, but the U.S. didn't have as good of an idea of how many divisions the Japanese could hold, could put forward. How much stuff did they have? And those estimates, as 45 went on, started to go up. They thought they'd initially be facing 3 divisions and a couple in reserve, and then all of a sudden they start getting into 8 divisions and in double digits. And it's not only military divisions that's in the one picture there, but if you can see that, if you make out the other picture there are 2 women there practicing machine gun training. So is the U.S. going to be going up against a civilian population? And these things started to get more worrisome as the summer wore on, as spring became summer. It's another interesting question here is who's in charge here? The Central Pacific had been commanded by the Navy under Admiral Nimitz. The Philippines had been commanded by MacArthur. And there's, some ego there, both people, but especially, I think, MacArthur. Rather interestingly, and now all these troops coming from Europe are Army. So technically, MacArthur should be in charge of that. There's an interesting question here. I think a lot of people probably wanted Nimitz, but when the U.S. started to promote 5-star generals in December 44, there were 7 promoted one day. The first one was Leahy, the second one was Marshall, the third one was King, the fourth one was MacArthur, fifth one was Nimitz. MacArthur outranks Nimitz by 1 day. So if he's not given charge of this invasion, he's going to, wait a minute, okay, whatever. A compromise seemed to be that in the European theater, because in the Pacific, the Navy was in charge of the Marines, the Army, MacArthur probably actually had more ships than Nimitz did. Of course, they weren't ocean-going aircraft carriers. They actually probably numerically had more ships in the invasions in New Guinea and the Philippines. The plan was going to be that the Navy was going to be in charge until they could establish a firm beachhead. Then the Army would be in charge, which seemed to be a compromise that everyone was willing to work with. Ultimately, MacArthur would be in charge, but things had to be under control before they turned it over to him. So I have a little picture of Al Haig there showing at the White House who's in charge here. Well, we didn't really know who was going to be in charge. June to October was not going to be a lull. There was going to be continued bombing of Japan. Estimates have it about 2.5 million tons equivalent of TNT was used in all of World War II, only 160,000 on Japan. By the fall, some estimates had that 1.8 million more tons of bombs would be dropped on Japan. So more than 10 times what had already been done. The Navy was doing an outstanding job of blockading Japan from that Indonesian, Southeast Asian resource base that it desperately needed. In 41, the Japanese had a merchant fleet of about 5.2 million tons of shipping. By August 45, 90% of that was gone. So maybe that would have made a factor. Plans weren't that definite. So let's see what happens next. Casualties. That is, of course, the Purple Heart. The numbers for the potential casualties were not pulled out of the air. The military put serious planning into this, and they used the unit of 1,000 man days. If you were within a mile or two of the front, 1,000 man days near the front, pardon the gender there, but that's the way it was. If you're behind the lines, if you're out at sea, for every 1,000 man days, based on previous experience in Europe and on Saipan and Okinawa and the Philippines, by April 45, they were calculating for every 1,000 man days, there would be 7.62 casualties and about 1.78 killed in action. You start multiplying this out. For the first 90 days for Olympic, there might be 109,000 dead. Coronet, 267,000 dead. Those others are wounded. And those numbers, when you add them up, they're basically the equivalent of all this U.S. soldiers who'd been killed all the way from December 41 to June 45. Amazing statistics. Some say those numbers are way too big and inflated. Others say they're too low. And we didn't know, the U.S. didn't know at the time. So here we go to casualties here.
Make the point about the Purple Heart, though.
Well, I'm going to get to that. That's the next slide, or next 2 slides. These are the casualties in Korea and Vietnam, and I hate to say et cetera, but the first Gulf War, these are killed and wounded in Korea and Vietnam. You see those 2 big ones. The first Gulf War, okay, Iraq, Afghanistan. You see the rest, Lebanon, Dominican Republic, Panama, Grenada, Iran, the hostage crisis. Look at all of those numbers there. Add all of them up, okay, just mentally in your head. Go to the next slide. Every Purple Heart It's been awarded since 1945 by the U.S. military. It was minted in the summer of 1945. Every name on the Vietnam Wall. There's Chosin Reservoir there. There's an IED in Iraq. There's a Vietnam Life magazine from summer of 69. Up the top, there's a little girl. I guess it's one of the happier stories. She's standing underneath her dad's Purple Heart. Every Purple Heart the U.S. has awarded since 45 was minted in the summer of, since getting ready for the invasion of Japan. That freaks me out a little bit. Please go to the next slide, because that really, I don't know what else I can say there. That speaks for itself. That was the preparation they had put in. And this was, don't forget, the war ended in August. They kept going to September and October. All right, so this is the invasion. This is what was going to happen. You want to go to the next slide? The Japanese were getting ready. They figured out the U.S. plan. They figured the U.S. would invade the southernmost island, then come later for Tokyo. And their plan was to, it was called Ketsugo. And their plan was to defend in depth, defend on the beach. There are a bunch, that picture there, I don't know how easy it is to see. There's a Japanese officer training a whole bunch of women with pointed spears. Don't know if that was true, or propaganda. Anyway, so the Japanese were getting ready for this. And here's what their plan was. Go to the next slide. This is a little hard to read, but this is an official U.S. Navy history. Their plan was to strip the will of the American people, kill as many American people as possible. I highlighted some of this. The objective was to break the will of the American people, to sustain such high casualties as to could not be sustained, and try to negotiate a surrender. Those are emphases added. Their plan wasn't to defeat the U.S. militarily, but politically. So don't know why my video went off there, but maybe that's a good thing. So the Japanese were getting ready for this. And if you go way back, we're not going to do that, but way back to the Japanese plan for East Asia all along, this greater Southeast Asia, greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, maybe they were trying to get the U.S. to just go home. We don't care about you. You don't care about us. Just leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. You have Europe. You have the Atlantic. You have South America. Give us Asia. That seems to be the Japanese plan for this whole thing. Obviously, you can go to the next slide. Obviously, none of this ever happened. But it was a long-term project that the Japanese were on. Remember, since the 1870s, they had this long-term plan. So that seems to be how they were planning to deal with the invasion. Break the will of the U.S. We can ask whether it would work or not. All right, you can go to the next slides here. So a couple things happened in early August there. August 6th and 9th, Glenn's going to get into 8th and 9th. Colin's going to get into. Japanese surrendered on the 14th. They accepted the terms, and of course, Tokyo Bay on September 2nd. So none of this ever happened. This is all hypothetical, which leads to the very last part of this. And if we even want to get into this, the what ifs. Would it have even happened? Would the aerial bombing and the naval blockade have stopped the war, have ended the war sometime in the autumn of 45? Would the U.S. and the Allies have said enough is enough, which is sort of what we were talking about before? And the Japanese were thinking about that. You see that not sign up there is what if the bomb hadn't worked, right? So these are interesting what if questions, and they're what if questions. So we don't have to answer them. So go to the next slide. So what if the Japanese had made a serious effort to try to end the war in the autumn of 45? Made a diplomatic effort that probably would have struck a chord with the people back home. So, all right. So, go to the next slide there. So, what if downfall had happened? What would the casualty figures have been? What would the U.S. post-war attitude have been towards Europe and Asia, the Soviet Union? Would there have been harsher treatment of the Japanese and the Germans? Would there have been a Marshall Plan? There was essentially a Marshall Plan for the Japanese. Would those have happened if the U.S. had sustained those casualties? If that VJ Day kiss had actually happened September 46 and not 45? There was a person mortally wounded. If you're going to go back to the last slide there, it's the very last thing, which I find is an interesting what if. There was a person mortally wounded in World War II. He took a long time for him to die. He eventually died. He was mortally wounded in World War II, but hung around for a while. Wondering if he would have died an earlier death. His name was Jim Crow. I have a hard time seeing how segregated units would have survived Operation Downfall. Can't possibly see that Black soldiers and sailors would not have been allowed or forced into the battle with those casualty figures. I think that Jim Crow would have died an earlier death had downfall happened in the casualty figures. All right, last slide at long last. We don't know. We will never know. We have the Welcome Home Well Done. That's the Hiroshima Peace Memorial down on the left. And by an amazing coincidence, that cantankerous coot there carrying a hand grenade on Utah Beach is my last slide, Glenn.
Warren Goss.
Instead of going to chase 95-year-old French woman like he's done the last couple times he's over there, he met with the farm girl who hit him out when he was in Normandy. So there's our 100-year-old guy going to Normandy. Maybe he would be going to Japan and chasing Japanese chicks. So who knows? All right. We don't know. We never know. Good discussion. Thank you so much. See where things go here.
Yeah, let's try to get into any comments, any questions. Well, before I make a point or two, let me ask if anybody would like to comment or ask a question.
I don't see any hands raised, but I do see Bob Flage. I do see Rick Weber's thumbs up for Greg. Here, Bob will ask you to unmute.
Yeah, gentleman had mentioned about the fellow that knew he was not going to make it if he ended up going to Japan. There were groups of people that wanted to go to Japan. My uncle was with the 17th Airborne, and they were talking about converting them or combining them with the 13th Airborne. And a bunch of these guys didn't want to, go with that change. And they had volunteered, and they were on a ship headed. And when the war actually ended in Japan, they turned their ship around and went to New York because they were on their way over to to get prepared.
Okay. Pat Hughes, did we unmute Pat? Let me unmute Pat.
Pat, go ahead. Pat, if you can unmute. Not working. Let's see, one more time.
I think you and I are double unmuting him, Sean.
All right.
I'll let you do it.
Okay. Pat, we'll try one more time. Okay, might have a problem with Pat's mic.
We're not hearing you, Pat.
Pat, if you want to put your question in the chat, go ahead. But he sees
There's a part that I blitzed over, a lot I blitzed over. Are there any Purple Heart recipients or families of Purple Heart recipients in the room from Korea or Vietnam?
You could hold your hand up if you're a Purple Heart recipient. We're going to count.
I just find it interesting that we know basically exactly when that Purple Heart was minted. It very well may be older than you are. If you're a Vietnam vet or Iraq vet or Afghanistan vet, that medal is older than you are.
If there's no other comments or questions, I'd like to make one because I've read a great deal about this and lectured on it a little bit as well. The Navy and the Air Force had very different ideas about ending the war. The Navy felt that the blockade would end the war. The Navy and mostly the submarine service, when Greg put up those statistics about the amount of Japanese shipping left at the end of the war, that was mostly the American submarine service, the silent service, that had sunk most of that shipping. And we're going to get into that next year, into the story of the silent service in the Pacific. They felt that they could, another few months of blockade and the Japanese would surrender. The Japanese were starving already. They had been on partial rations for a couple of 3 years. Okay. The other part was LeMay and the Air Force, Hap Arnold, felt that we could bomb them into submission and Michelle, I know you know a lot about this, that we had already not only decimated Tokyo, but 40 or 50 of the other Japanese cities had been, because they're all made out of wood and paper mache basically at that time. And I'm convinced those two would have worked. The problem was how much time it would take. Had it taken another, if you thought you could do that and it could be done in a matter of a month, okay. But, given the Japanese culture and the attitude and the dysfunctional character of the Japanese government to make a decision, I personally don't think that either one of those, we couldn't wait long enough to see if either one of those would work. I don't know. Michelle, any thoughts on that? I think here, let me unmute.
I can't. We kept you. We were unmuting each other. Yeah, no, it's in some ways the defeat of Japan is overdetermined, right? Because you can look at the blockade, which was certainly starving Japan's cities to death. You can look at the firebombing campaign, which again killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese. We firebombed Tokyo twice. To the point where when our soldiers came in the immediate aftermath of the war, it looked like the surface of the moon. You also had the entry of the Soviets into the war immediately after the nuclear bombings, which was something that the professionals in the Japanese army, particularly in China, where Japan had the vast majority of its army at that point. I think something on the order of like 2 or 3 million men just in China. They understood that was the end as well. And politically, Japan had been teetering quite violently for the previous year. We often tend to think there's a great new book I highly recommend about Tojo. It's a biography of Tojo. And it's not, let me just emphasize, it's not sympathetic, and neither am I to Tojo, just to be clear. But I certainly understood Tojo to be kind of like the Japanese Hitler or the Japanese Mussolini. And, much like the article that came out celebrating VJ Day, Japan was just a very complicated, dysfunctional government as well, and had been really since the 1930s, when it was very much divided between, hardline militarists who, wanted to create something like the Third Reich in Japan, and just more traditional, small L liberals, not liberals in the modern sense of progressives, but small L liberals, who liked the fact that Japan had become one of the most prosperous modern societies in the world by the 1930s, and that was a death struggle, certainly in the views of its participants, for the soul of Japan, such that there was almost a coup, an assassination of the emperor, before he actually surrendered, following the atomic bombings and the Soviets' entry into the war. So, Japan in 1945 was a society that, if not in full collapse, was collapsing for so many different reasons, and which is what ultimately makes, I think, VJ Day coming as VJ is sort of an interesting moment, because it's both inevitable, and everyone, I think, at the time knew that, for all of the reasons we just talked about. But it also came, I think, sooner than a lot of people thought too. As obviously the planning for the invasion of the main island suggested, right? We were anticipating a war that would drag on for several more years, and then it all wrapped up very suddenly.
Yeah, for sure. Thankfully, it wrapped
up. Thank God. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, unless there's any other comments.
There's a question in the chat from Ernest. He says, shouldn't the initial VJ Day, 14th, 15th August, have been considered presumptive, with all the fighting that continued through the month of August, as well as the coup against the government/emperor? Wait, my thing jumped. Even President Truman said the citizens should wait to celebrate until it was official, signed and sealed as it was on the 2nd of September.
That's not wrong. One of the remarkable things, though, about I certainly in that period, right, between the agreement to surrender on the 14th and the announcement on the radio of Hirohito's surrender on the 15th. That was a very touch and go moment. So I think that's definitely correct. The one of the surprising things, though, and I don't know the full scope of the Pacific Theater, so I don't want to overstate this, but I did study China fairly closely and the end of the war in China. One of the remarkable things was the degree to which Japan's army ceased fire on the 15th, to the point that by like within days, and I mean like I think the first OSS liberation operations of the prisoners of war camps in China, which again is the lion's share of the Japanese army at that point, they land literally by in 2-3 days. I'm trying to remember the exact day. I think it was I want to say it was the 17th, but it might have been the 18th. And there's an anecdote which I'll share, which gets to your point, but I think is telling in several ways. Is this OSS commando team? We're talking a dozen guys literally just get flown over this prisoner of war camp outside of Beijing and make their way towards it, Fengtai prison camp. And as they're walking up, they take fire from the prison camp, and they hit the dirt. And ultimately, it's not until I think a lieutenant drives out in a truck and picks them up and puts them on the truck and tells them, the soldiers don't know the war's over yet. You almost got yourself killed, but we'll protect you, right? And that was to give you a sense of how the Japanese army itself both, surrendered certainly at the officer corps level, but also I think even understood its own vulnerability in that moment, in part because they weren't sure that the enlisted ranks would necessarily obey if they knew the war was over.
A similar point along those ways, which I've read about and we'll watch some podcasts about, is as the U.S. troops came ashore on Japan post August 14th to begin the occupation, they came ashore, the Marines, I can't remember which city they came into, but they came into fully loaded, prepared for combat, but not being sure what resistance they may find, right? And I'm pretty sure there was virtually no resistance anywhere.
Mm-mm.
Within a few days, the Marines and the soldiers landing ready to, make battle if need be, begin to relax. And it's almost a wondrous sort of event that it went so quickly from war to peace, and the Japanese accepted the peace. And towards the end here, I think we're going to get into one major reason why that occurred. So we'll hold that off. I'd like to jump.
Sorry, Don Patton's had his hand up for a while. I wanted to get to him.
This is Don Patton with
Hey.
the World War II Roundtable in Minnesota. We're putting together a VJ program for September 9th. We're going to have John McManus and John Parshall as our featured historians. But we do have two veterans. One that I would like to mention to build on a point that was made here. We have a veteran here in Minnesota that was shot down in a B-29 in April of 45. And he tells the story, among many, that when he landed, the civilians were challenging him with those pointed sticks that you showed. And it was actually the Japanese military that saved him from the civilians because apparently, the Japanese wanted to interrogate him, as he tells about later in our, as he'll do on our program in September. But they really had, I think the word indoctrinated the civilians to do a expanded defense of the islands.
Yeah. No doubt. No doubt. Thank you, Don. So,
Glenn, I hope we didn't steal your thunder there. I hope the atomic bombs aren't considered anticlimactic.
well, at this point, I'm not going to talk so much about the dropping of the bomb itself, the mechanics of dropping the bomb. It's more about the decision to drop the bomb. Okay. We're actually in October going to have, let me get this up properly. We're actually going to have Paul Tibbets IV, the grandson of Paul Tibbets, on the program to talk about his grandfather, who he knew very well. and that's retired General Paul Tibbets IV, the Air Force Academy grad, served in the 80s, 90s, in the beginning of the 2000s, flew all the major heavy bombers, including the B-52. And he talks rather eloquently about his father and what happened there. We wanted to have him on actually a couple weeks ago, but timing just got, scheduling got in the way. So let me go to this for just 10 minutes, and then we'll take a station break, Sean. Um, so who made the decision and how was the decision? No, how was the decision made? Who made the decision to drop the atomic bomb, right? 2 months ago, we had Robert Norris on, the author of the book on General Groves, the indispensable man behind the Manhattan Project. And he did just a wonderful job in that book of highlighting Groves' role in all of this. Because I think Groves' legacy has suffered relative to Oppenheimer, the movie, the attention that Oppenheimer has had in our culture versus Groves. Groves was, as you can see in this picture, not the most Hollywood attractive sort of guy, right? Oppenheimer had that kind of rather fascinating, sexy background almost, his flirtation with communism and all of that. And plus, he's such a. Anyway, let's just for a moment remind ourselves of the men who were in charge of all this. And for most of the war, these were the three guys: Marshall, Stimson, and Groves. Marshall, U.S. Chief of Staff of the Army, but really the primary, without title, the primary military leader of the country. Okay. Stimson, back then, the Secretary of War, which really meant that the Secretary of the Army, right, is the way it was before the Defense Department came about in 1948. They were the ones that hired Groves, and it was Groves, as we recounted in that program, starting in rather late, I think September of 1942, driving the program. Okay. So those were the men up until the point where FDR dies. And then these two men really come into play in a big way. Obviously, Truman takes over as president, but he also brings in, is it James? I think it's James Burns as his Secretary of State. And James Burns was no, shallow, quiet guy. He was a major politician, had been senator, and was very strong-willed in terms of advising Truman about the dropping of the atomic bomb. So out of this and the back and forth that Michelle and I had and the continued reading I've been doing, I think really comes two thoughts about how the decision or who made the decision. I'm going to call the first one kind of what Robert Norris came up with in his book. And I call it, this is my term, the Groves momentum factor, or it could be the Manhattan Project momentum factor. And what I mean by that is, if you remember that program, Groves had spent $2 billion of U.S. money in developing the bomb, which today sounds like an afterthought. That's just a couple hours in Washington, D.C. But back then it was one of the largest budget items, right? And so I don't want to, I actually thought about trying to get Robert Norris on again, but he's not easy to reach. But if you read his book carefully, he kind of puts a lot of emphasis on this momentum, and that he never finds in his research a document that proves that Truman approved a bomb. Okay. So I shared all that with Michelle, and Michelle came back to me and said, what?
Yeah, I think that's right in the sense of, like, if you're looking for a single order that says Harry Truman, I, Harry Truman, President of the United States, hereby order the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. You're not going to find that. And I think that's in part for, Several, yeah, there are a lot of probably reasons for that, but I think probably the biggest single one is that's not necessarily how the chain of command operated at the time, and it's also, um, I think it also overstates how significant a decision it necessarily was. It was understood to be a very grave decision, and it was understood to be a spectacular new weapon. I can't overstate that. But by the same token, along the lines of that I was, had spoken about maybe a little bit earlier today, if you think about the context of the time and just how people evaluated the things like casualties, right? We killed more people in firebombing in a single mission than we did with any of the atomic bombs. It was about 800,000 in Hiroshima, probably another 60,000 in Nagasaki. And that's not, once you get into these numbers, it seems ridiculous, but that's still less than what the firebombing entailed. And so the idea that the president would necessarily need to sign off in like a very like the way we have now, where we have modern nuclear command and control systems, it's just not how people thought about these kinds of problems in 1945. They knew it was a major innovation, and Truman understood that, I think, probably more than many people, even within his inner circle, did. But the idea that it was somehow a radical new thing to drop a massive bomb that could kill 100,000 people was just not how they thought about things at that time. So in the very narrow technical sense, there's no single document showing Harry Truman ordering the bombing of Hiroshima. Yeah, that's probably true. But if you actually dig into the documents, you see a couple different things happen. And I laid the timeline out in happy nerd detail in some emails with Glenn. But what you do see is, Harry Truman is at the Potsdam Conference. All this momentum obviously is already building up behind the dropping of the bomb. And so I think there's probably a general presumption that we're going to drop the bomb. That said, we're at the Potsdam Conference when the Trinity test is conducted. And I'm going to probably mess up the dates here precisely, but on the date the Trinity test is conducted, a message is sent back to Truman and Marshall, who are in Potsdam negotiating the Potsdam Declaration, saying that yes, in fact, the atomic bomb works. The following day, Harry Truman lets here you can get my dates. Oh, this is a later correspondence, but and the following day, Harry Truman has a meeting with Joseph Stalin. So the following day, within a few days, has a meeting with Joseph Stalin, notifying him of the United States possession of a bomb, of an atomic bomb, and that it works, and that we're planning to drop it on Japan. Joseph Stalin's reaction, according to Harry Truman's diaries, is good. Let them have it. But nevertheless, the following day, Harry Truman meets both with Henry Stimson and with George Marshall. And there is still some question, I think, at least as late as that, as to where the bombs will be dropped. There's a target list. There's a standing target list that includes, I think, up until the end of July, Kyoto. And there's a lot of concern, particularly from Henry Stimson, but one that is shared by Harry Truman, that the bombing of Kyoto would in fact be an atrocity. Not necessarily because it was a nuclear bomb, but because Kyoto was not a military city. And Truman was very adamant that the dropping of the first atomic bomb be against a military target, and that it not create either, just the propaganda opportunity for the Axis powers to say that Americans are engaged in butchery, and also just a moral dimension that the United States was not going to be a country that was going to start indiscriminately bombing civilians for no military purpose in this spectacular way. And so as late as this period, when Stalin is being notified the Trinity tests are being after the Trinity test has proven successful, Truman, with Stimson's very much support, takes Kyoto off the target list. Then they have a meeting. There's no direct written record that I've certainly found, but I haven't done the exhaustive archival research on this, of exactly what happens at that meeting. But he does meet with Marshall, does meet with Stimson. And then that very same day, an order comes down, essentially from the desk of Marshall, from Marshall's, essentially the acting chief, who's acting as the deputy chief of staff, but he's acting as the chief of staff while Marshall's in Potsdam. Going down to the chain of command to Hap Arnold, who is the head of the Air Force, directing that the bombing of Japan take place essentially on the first day following August 3rd, that essentially weather permitting, and giving the target list, the approved target list, now with Kyoto taken off of it, down to Hap Arnold, who in turn delegates that order down to Curtis LeMay, whose command ultimately drops the bomb. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry, I'm going through a bit of a timeline here, but go ahead. Yeah.
But just this document on the right, I think it's as close as we can get to a written order that says, yeah, go ahead. It's the document from that you shared with me from Harry S. Truman to the Secretary will reply to yours 41. That's this memo over here that you just covered. Approved, release when ready, but no sooner than August 2nd. I mean,
that's correct.
Truman was involved in this in every way, and I have come to agree with you, even though there's no, executive order that we can reach into and read line by line saying, yeah, go ahead and drop this bomb. It really was Truman's decision.
Absolutely, and he owns that too. And the last sort of point I'll make, I know I'm a historian, so I'll get nerdy into the documents and give you all my proof. That's my lawyer and historian brain coming all at the same time.
Dangerous combination.
Very dangerous combination for someone to get into the details. But the other thing I think that confirms all of that is Harry Truman's own diary. From the day he has this meeting with Stimson and Marshall, from the day the order is issued down to Hap Arnold to proceed with the dropping of the atomic bomb from August 3rd onward, weather permitting, in which he ruminates on this decision quite explicitly, and actually says at one point, and I think in a way that's quite poignant, thank God we were the ones who got this instead of the Japanese or the Nazis. And he doesn't say that just because we would have lost the war, but he is reflecting, in fact, on his decision to take Kyoto off the list, and reflecting on the fact that the Germans would not have made a comparable decision. That, thankfully, a democracy that's concerned with things like human rights, with even the lives of its enemies, and with international law and the law of war, is the one that got to this weapon first, and not the Axis powers. And so yeah, I'm firmly convinced, in all the evidence, contemporaneous evidence, not just people reflecting on it after the fact, but the contemporaneous evidence certainly shows Truman, very much at the helm of the decision, and that was appropriate, and I think that's what everyone understood.
Yeah. Any comments or anything in the chat, Sean, about this particular aspect of the end of the war in the Pacific? Any questions of Michelle?
I'm looking around the room to see if there's any hands raised. I don't see any. Rich Kensinger, I'll ask you to unmute.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I come with a medic perspective. I come at this as a clinical psychologist. I've done tremendous amount of clinical research on combat trauma. I did read an article about the bomb's effect on Nagasaki. Now, I know how most people died, and you have to understand that the impacts of radioactivity went through at least 4 generations of Japanese. It's like Agent Orange in Vietnam, 4 generations impacted. So can we discuss a little bit the casualties? A lot of innocent people were killed, maimed, wounded. I call them murdered. That's from a clinical medical perspective. So can we discuss that a little bit more? Because somebody has to take responsibility for that.
Yeah, I'll take that on, and I take that answer on as someone who is candidly deeply ambivalent, and I don't claim to have a triumphalist view of the atomic bombing, so please don't misunderstand me. As a military historian, as a lawyer, I still think about these things in a very humane way, and in my legal practice, I primarily have largely worked in the human rights space as well, and so I do take everything you said incredibly seriously, and I think the only thing fundamentally that I can say in response to that is that it's not it's to avoid what's sometimes called presenteeism, and I don't mean that in a dismissive way, because I think people took these issues very seriously at the time as well. Um, but looking back, I don't think, and we know for a fact that there was not a high level of confidence about the effects of nuclear radiation from a radioactive blast. They had done a lot of studies on the health effects of exposure to fissile material, we'd call like a dirty bomb or something like that. But the lingering effects of radiation were actually not well understood, and how could they be, right? This was literally the first time this was happening. And so the the questions that we have come to understand as being highly relevant to the dropping of atomic bombs just weren't questions we knew enough to answer to even have yet. They were the unknown unknowns to some extent. That's not to say no one thought about it, but that was not front of mind. And so that's one part. Another though, and again, this is a presenteeism thing, and I think it's not to condemn the people who acted in the past. They were acting in the time they lived, and so it's just a fact that the way people thought about civilian casualties in 1945 is just not the way we think about them today. And I think that's a good thing, because the way people thought about civilian casualties in 1945 was nothing like the way people thought about civilian casualties in 1865. And certainly nothing like the way people thought about them in 1785. Like, we do progress as people. We become more humane. We become more compassionate to those who are different from us and those who are enemies. And so, um, that's not to say, and they took these concerns extremely seriously, in ways that some of our allies very much did not, to include the Soviets, to be sure, or the British for that matter. The British had a very I'll just call it pragmatic view of German casualties that the United States very much did not share, for fundamentally humanitarian reasons. Some strategic,
I
but
would
fundamentally.
volunteer the Japanese themselves relative to their treatment of the Chinese.
Or the Japanese themselves, absolutely. But I'm trying to avoid the whataboutism, right, of it too, in leaving them aside. I'm speaking only of our allies. Again, say nothing of the Germans and the Japanese themselves, of course. But so I think that's also part of it, is that even thinking about the scale of casualties that we had already both incurred and inflicted, civilian casualties, whether or not it was in the fire bombings or elsewhere, um, make the dropping of the atomic bomb comparatively, par for the course, slightly high, but not unusually high for the amount of civilian casualties that we had essentially taken as routine in the context of the air war, particularly against Japan, but also against Germany. And then finally, there is like a ruthless logic to war, and I think that's what also made the risk of civilian casualties both acceptable at the time and difficult to weigh today. And that is, when you're looking at the planning of the invasion of the main islands, and you're looking at anywhere from 750,000 to 1 million American casualties expected. That's not even counting the millions of Japanese civilians that were expected to be killed as well. And when you compare the bombings, even the fire bombings, even the worst of the fire bombings in percentage terms, to the number of civilian casualties in things like the Battle of Okinawa, it's not even comparable, right? It like literally there was barely a man living on places like Tinian and Saipan. And so the understanding, like an air war is incredibly violent, I think from a strategic standpoint, actually not as effective as offered, but there was as strange as it may sound, a humanitarian argument for trying to use air power as a method of warfare that was protective not only of American personnel who wouldn't have to fight, but the expected casualties that would have been sort of wreaked against the civilian population in a land war. And so fundamentally, these are all horrific, tragic choices, right? That's ultimately what, I think any fair-minded historian looking at the time has to conclude, that no one not knowing. Very few people, and certainly few people in any kind of responsibility, were looking to kill civilians in the American context. But it was a pragmatic decision that was controversial. Eisenhower opposed dropping the bomb for what it was worth. He offered that opinion to Marshall, and it was, and they took it as a deadly serious decision that was motivated by winning the war as quickly as possible with the least harm as possible. And so I think we can simultaneously say that it was a profound tragedy and it unleashed forces in the world that were um, that have shaped our world for the next 100 years. But I think it also, I'm very, very reluctant to condemn anyone who was forced to make that decision as well, because I think they were doing the best they could for very good reasons.
I
John
get
Patton, you had your hand raised.
Yeah,
just
I
incredibly.
do.
If I could, Don, hold on just one. Michelle, it's just an incredibly eloquent answer that I applaud you for it. I'm not going to try to add to it. Don, please go ahead.
Well, I think we're trying to make too many decisions 80 some odd years after the fact. If you look at the knowledge base that we had then, Madame Curie, who did a lot of the work with radioactive material as a scientist, ended up dying from radiation poisoning because they didn't know what radiation did. And we have actually done programs here in Minnesota debating dropping the bomb or not dropping the bomb. But we're doing a program also this fall on the testing at Trinity. We have the historian from White Sands coming up, and when you look at it, they didn't know what they knew that the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima would work. It was a shotgun design, but the implosion design, which was the Nagasaki and subsequent bombs, implosion, they didn't know what it would do, and that's actually where the greater power came from. So I think we're fools if we try to make decisions today with the knowledge we have today and judge, criticize the tough decisions, as Michelle has talked about, the knowledge base we had in 44, 45.
100% agree as well. To try to put yourself back in that time frame in July, August of 1945 is virtually impossible for us to do today, other than reading what we can read and trying to see it from that context without knowing what we know today. So, look, we could do a whole program on the question of the morality of it all, and we're running out of time. So, unless there's other comments, I'd like to move on to the last kind of points about our program tonight. I don't see that Colin ever joined, Sean. Something must have happened. I hope he's okay.
Yeah, I did not see him. I reached out just as a reminder, but hopefully everything's all right. Otherwise, I say we continue. Or if you need to do a quick station break.
Yes.
Yeah, just take that station break.
Okay, don't need to say much along these lines, but other than just sharing, thank you UPMC for Life for supporting VBC and sponsoring this program. You can check out all their plan options that are made by veterans for veterans by visiting upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. We already talked about our magazine, but if you don't receive it, if you're new to us, please send us your address and we'll be happy to put you on the mailing list. It is a free quarterly magazine. It's always a great read, 32 pages of veteran stories, history, education, stories that we capture, we put in the magazine. So please get us that address. Next Monday, or this coming Monday, I should say, Valhalla Boys, that's misspelled there, but it's Valhalla Boys. Brennan Morton, he was a Marine recon sniper in Iraq. We're going to have him on. Great book, great guy. Really excited to talk with him. I'll be hosting that program as Glenn and Todd are going to be heading off to Europe. And we will not have a program Thursday night for 2 weeks. So everybody join me Monday night to talk with for the talk with Brennan Morton. And then the following Monday, I'm going to have an open conversation. That's where I'm just going to open up the program and open up the mic. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings on whatever's going on in the veteran space or whatever you'd like to talk about that night. So that'll be Monday, September 1st. So looking forward to that while you guys are touring there, Todd or Glenn. So
yeah,
enjoy.
I'm leaving tomorrow night. I get a couple of days in London on my own where I can go dig into my favorite Anglo-Saxon England. So joy for me. Al Smith always has some very pertinent comments. Al, I unmuted you. What's up?
Yeah, I don't, I'm so sorry for getting on so late. I just came back from a function, but I did want to share a story that I was going to bring up when we talked about this, the atomic bomb and the author or that, whatever. Is it okay to do it now, or do you have other stuff you want to cover?
How long is it, Al?
It takes a minute.
Okay, jump into it.
And it goes to the secrecy of that whole Manhattan Project and the bomb. I was at a veterans function and I was talking to a guy who said that his father was the crew chief for the Enola Gay. And I said, "You're kidding me." And he says, "No." And he pulled out a picture of this soldier with his hand up against the Enola Gay, smiling, whatever. And I said, "Was that taken before the plane took off?" He said, "No." He said, when that was taken when it came back, because when it was loaded, even he, the crew chief, didn't know it was an atomic bomb. Obviously, it was a very special operation, and it was this bomb that looked very different, but he had no idea it was the atomic bomb. And only when they were coming back was he then informed that it was an atomic bomb. So when it landed, then he went out, put his hand up against it, and somebody took a picture of him, which I thought, if the crew chief didn't know it was an atomic bomb, that's secrecy.
That is. But, you know, the thing that occurs to me, Al, if I had been in that spot in 1945 and somebody had told me, "Hey, that's an atomic bomb over there," I said, what are you talking about? What's an atomic bomb? Right? Most 99.9% of the world would have no understanding of what that is, right? I mean, other than it's a bigger bomb and it's going to make a bigger explosion, but no true understanding of it. But thank you, Al. So
Glenn, real quick, I know you're going to do the surrender, but since Colin wasn't on, I think that's one of the reasons why you let me go on as long as I did. Really quickly for the audience, as a friendly reminder, for most of the Pacific War, the Soviets and the Japanese were not at war. And at the Yalta Conference in February 45, restated at Potsdam in July, the Soviets had agreed with the Western Allies, Britain and the US, to declare war on Japan within 90 days after the end of the European War, VE Day. So that 90 days, by an amazing coincidence, just happened to happen around August 7, 8, 9, depending on how you count the days. So the Soviet Union did declare war on Japan August 8th, August 9th, invaded the Japanese in Manchuria, China, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to let the audience make sure they knew about that. Back in the summer of 45, the peace faction was trying to negotiate through the Soviets, not realizing they were getting ready to go to war, to try to negotiate some sort of terms. FYI, just the audience, the Soviets entered the Pacific War roughly around the time of the nuclear weapons, FYI.
Yeah. And actually, they invaded what is now Manchuria on August the 8th. So 2 days after the Hiroshima bomb, day before the Nagasaki bomb. They didn't know that the Nagasaki bomb was going to be dropped that day. And it really was. And I'll put up these last couple of slides. And all of this is covered very eloquently again in Todd's article in our most recent magazine. In depth. I mean, I think it goes on for 5 or 6 pages, but it's a very good read. And by the way, if you want to read another book that really uncovers gives you a sense for the inner workings of the Japanese government and Hirohito and those main ministers, it's a book by, I think his first name is Harold. His last name is Bix, Harold Bix, and it's his biography of Hirohito, written probably now 15 or so years ago. Highly recommend it to you. It's one of those 700-page sort of biographies, but it's chilling almost to understand how dysfunctional this man, Emperor Hirohito, and his government was. And, it brings into play just who was in charge. And the answer was kind of nobody, right? They had towards the end of the war, you had, as Todd recounts in his article, you had the three peace ministers and you had the three war ministers. Those were in favor of more war, those are in favor of peace. Recall that there was always a naval minister in the cabinet and an army minister in the cabinet. And they had to be in the cabinet. And if either one resigned, the cabinet and the government dissolved. So that's how the military came to control the Japanese government. Okay. They would not speak their mind. There was no candid discussion about, what the alternatives were, especially in front of the emperor. And they would sit in these meetings with the emperor there, and the emperor never said a word, right? There was a man, I'm going to forget his name, but the sort of they modeled it after the British aristocracy, unfortunately, just like they modeled their navy after the British. There was a man who was, I think, called the I don't know, the chancellor of something or other, and he would listen to all this, and then he would speak with Hirohito, and Hirohito would kind of indicate to him what he thought. But even then, Hirohito hardly, said anything. So if you look at the timeline in Todd's article, the bombs are dropped. They're having these meetings. They're still saying, no, we don't want to surrender. The first bomb is dropped. The Soviets invade Manchuria. Finally, Hirohito says something that says it's time to surrender, right? I don't have the exact dates right here in my head. This is all leading up to August the 14th. Hirohito actually records a message on like an LP, if you will. That night that he recorded the message, there's an attempted coup by some radical elements of the Japanese military, and they break into the palace to try to find this recording so that it can be broken up and not played. They're not successful. They're finally stopped before it goes too far. And the next day is when the people of Japan hear Hirohito speak for the first time. And Greg, did they understand him very well?
He was so isolated from the population and spoke an archaic form of palace Japanese that was so far removed from what the average person spoke that many of the people who heard his voice literally did not understand what he was saying. There had to be an announcer come on after the recording and say, as our emperor has just stated, and then put it in plain Japanese. That's how removed he was from the population of his own country.
And the Japanese people thought they were hearing the voice of God. Am I overstating that, Greg?
Let's say some sort of divine voice. Yeah, let's say not an incarnate God, but a divine voice, if you want to make a slight distinction there. Sure, yeah.
And back to Michelle's point about the army and the population basically surrendering peacefully, it's, I believe, and if you read Bix's book, he states this that way, it's a result of Hirohito making this announcement. As
very much.
Ubiquitous as it was. He never says the word surrender. Never, right? And the Japanese people accept it because it was, the divine speaking to them. And of course, then, now the other thing we can't forget about the back and forth, and it's actually Secretary Burns that convinces Truman of this, the back and forth about the terms of surrender, because we had said only we would have unconditional surrender. But there was one condition that was allowed, and that was that Hirohito could continue as Emperor of Japan, right? And if you look at the words, the communications back and forth, basically it says, yeah, you can continue. And then there's a little phrase in there that says something like, and I don't have the exact words here in front of me, but I'll paraphrase them, like, subject to the military command, i.e. MacArthur, who will be in place. And then when the surrender takes place, and within a few days, there's a picture, we didn't put it up here, of MacArthur and Hirohito standing next to each other. Hirohito comes to MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo. And there's a picture taken that is then released to the Japanese press. And there's MacArthur at 6'2" or whatever he was, and Hirohito at 5'6" or 5'5", looking up at him, sort of his eyes sort of glancing up at him. And that just finalized the point that while Hirohito would be there, he'd be a figurehead and not the commander. So that's all I've got to say. That's the end of the war. Thank the Lord. And what a complicated process. Comments or questions? We're right at the 8:30 hour. Michelle, are you still with us?
I don't see Michelle. He might have had to pop off.
Yeah, he actually might want to go home and have supper, Anybody else like to volunteer? I see Al. You still have your hand up from before, Al, or is this something more?
No, it's something new.
Okay.
And I guess it's more of the Japanese mindset. I lived for 3 years in Japan, and I remember talking with an old Japanese, very wise guy, smart guy, and he said, Smith-san, you have to understand, the Japanese, we are followers. Americans, they will question. And he said, if we all decide and the emperor says, go over the cliff, we will all go over the cliff and follow. He said, Americans will say, wait a minute, why are we going over the cliff? And I always remember that.
Yeah. I'll end with a quick story unless someone else has one. So I worked for Mellon Bank for a long time in the international department. And when I moved to Brazil in the mid 80s, my boss was a great guy. And he had just come for a year before from the office in Tokyo, and he spoke fluent Japanese. One of the few, outsiders who spoke really. He grew up partly in Japan, blah blah blah. And he told me the story. He was on a train one day. He had to go down to Hiroshima for something or other for business, and he's on this train in Hiroshima, and he's obviously American. Looks like me, big white guy with not, well, now gray hair, but back then blonde hair. And he's just minding his own business. And he notices this elder Japanese guy coming over towards him a couple of times. And this Japanese man finally comes over to him and starts kicking him in the shin rather violently. And of course, my friend sort of jumps up and defends himself, and other Japanese pull him away. And apparently that man was a Hiroshima bombing victim. A couple of Japanese explained it to him, and he just, sort of lost it for a moment there. So I always thought of that story, and that was in the 1980s, 40 years after the event. But obviously, these extreme emotions still exist, or at least existed back then. I think we're maybe over them because just time has healed to some degree. Sean Hall, I think we're done.
Yeah, great conversation tonight. Ernest, I don't know if you're new to us. I don't recognize your name, but Ernest, thank you for all of the information in the chat. There's a lot of different things that Ernest helped. Oh, great. Well, welcome. I hope to maybe have you back. Be great to have you back. Also like to know how you heard about us. It's always fun to welcome new people. But a lot of good information tonight, Glenn and Greg. I'm sure we'll connect with Colin, make sure everything's good. But thank you all for being here this evening. And I hope we want to wish bon voyage to Glenn and Todd. See you guys in a few short weeks. We're going to have a great couple programs while you're gone. I'll do a couple online events and even an in-person while you guys are out.
Sean, we have great confidence you will carry on valiantly without us as we muck around Europe. I'm going to go muck around in Anglo-Saxon England here the next 2 days. So everybody take care. Thank you so very much. Greg, thank you for all your effort. I'm going to call Colin as soon as we're done here because
Great. Okay. Yes.
Thank you, everyone.